My father-in-law, Mark, thinks women shouldn't work. However, when we joke that he should quit his job and then he'd have to give us money, he quickly wants to go back to work because he can't support his mistress. I'm 32, and my husband, David, who is 34, and I have been together for 8 years, but we've only been married for 4. We live about 40 minutes outside the city. Both of us work, but while my salary was decent and the job kept me busy, I was never truly passionate about it. My in-laws also live out of town, about 20 minutes from us. My mother-in-law, Susan, is kind and has always welcomed me warmly. Mark, however, is a different story. He's very rigid about how things should be. He has an opinion on everything, from politics to how a dolphin's respiratory system works. He probably has absolutely no idea how it functions, but he loves to share his opinions anyway. I already knew this side of him before I even met him. David gave me a heads up and some tips on how to let him talk and then steer the conversation away. Another issue is that he rarely gives you his opinion directly. Instead, he drops hints. He'll casually mention things like, "A friend's daughter-in-law didn't go back to work after getting married," or "Women today don't know what they're missing by staying at home." He couldn't possibly be referring to himself because I don't see Susan celebrating having Mark around her all the time. I quickly learned that the most practical approach with Mark was to simply acknowledge what he said and then change the subject. He might continue talking, but the rest of us would have already moved on and be discussing something else entirely. David nicknamed this my grenade dodging strategy. My parents are different. They both retired 2 years ago and are the type who believe everyone should do what makes them happy. They've seen my in-laws at a few parties and weddings. They maintain polite conversations, but they are the complete opposite, at least when it comes to Mark. About 6 months ago, my job started to take a turn for the worse. The company began experiencing problems, and suddenly, everyone was scrambling. My boss resigned, and they didn't replace her. Her tasks were distributed among the remaining staff. I was working 60 hours a week and receiving emails at midnight. I'd get home, and David would already have dinner ready because I was completely exhausted. On weekends, I'd sleep until noon just to partially recover. I started thinking about quitting. A year prior, I had mentioned to David that I wanted to start my own business, doing the same kind of work I did, but on a smaller scale and managed by myself. I had experience and contacts. The only things holding me back were fear and the security of a steady paycheck. However, the chaos at my job quickly solved that. After 6 months, I was ready for anything, even to open a mental asylum. David and I had a serious talk about it. We crunched the numbers and realized we had savings. His salary could cover our basic needs tightly for a while, but it was feasible. In fact, he encouraged me to take the leap. Then, I was offered a promotion. It came with a title change and a substantial pay raise. The downside was that I would have to transfer to the main office downtown, a 2-hour commute each way. I could work remotely 3 days a week, but I'd need to be in the office on Tuesdays and Wednesdays for meetings. I asked for time to think about it. The truth was, I was already mentally checked out. The promotion felt like a bribe to keep me. I went home and told David. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I replied that I wanted to decline it and start my business as we had planned. He agreed. 2 weeks later, we had dinner at my in-laws' house. My parents were also invited because it was David's birthday. My mind was preoccupied, figuring out how I would tell my boss that I was declining the promotion. My mom asked me something about work, and without thinking, I blurted out that I had been offered a promotion, but it would mean a much heavier workload. My parents were excited. Mark didn't speak immediately, but I saw him glance at David and then at his plate. Susan asked if I was going to accept it. I replied that I was still considering it. Mark cleared his throat and declared that in his day, a wife didn't need to chase promotions. A good husband should be able to support his family without his wife having to work herself to death. David told him that times had changed and that things were fine the way they were. Mark ignored him and continued his rant. Susan asked him to stop, but Mark didn't relent. He posed the question, if Sarah takes that promotion and spends even more time away, how will she properly care for her husband? He then stated, ambitious women end up divorced because they forget what marriage is all about. David stood up and told him to drop the subject. Mark added that if they had had this conversation when David first started dating me, perhaps things would have been different. Susan began clearing plates, even though we were still eating. We all left shortly after. At the entrance, my mom hugged me and told me to ignore Mark, and my dad agreed that he had gone too far. Once home, David apologized for his father. I told him it wasn't his fault, but something Mark said did resonate with me. Not the part about women staying home, but the part about working myself to death. He had a point there. Even if his reasoning was rubbish, I was burnt out. I didn't want that promotion. I didn't want more time in that office. I wanted out. We had already decided this, but what Mark said was like the final push to make the decision. But first, David suggested we play a prank on his father. We hatched a plan. David would call his father to tell him I had resigned. He would explain that I had taken Mark's advice seriously and was going to be a traditional wife. However, he would also say that our lifestyle was expensive and we relied on my income. Now, without my salary, we were struggling, and since the idea had come from Mark, it was only fair that he help us financially while David advanced in his career. David called him the next day. I was glued to his side, listening. When he told Mark that I had resigned, there was a pause. Mark asked why. David replied, "I realized you were right about her not needing to work so much." Mark sounded pleased and called it a smart decision. Then, David steered the conversation. He mentioned that a problem had arisen. Our mortgage, car payments, and other expenses exceeded what his salary could cover. My salary had covered about 40% of our monthly expenses. Mark wanted to know if we had already cut all non-essential spending. David replied that we had. "We canceled streaming services and stopped eating out," he said. We calculated and determined we needed about $2,000 a month to fill the gap. There was a long silence. Then Mark asked why David was telling him this. David blurted out, "Because the idea of my wife quitting was yours, and I wanted you to put your money where your mouth is." Mark started offering budgeting strategies. David cut him off. He reminded him that he grew up comfortably and that his father always provided. It didn't seem fair that he should now suffer after taking Mark's advice. Mark's entire speech about women staying home and men providing came to a halt when he blurted out, "Perhaps it would be better if Sarah went back to work," which was already too late because I had already submitted my resignation. Mark asked if my parents could help, and David lied, saying we had already asked them, and they said that since it was Mark's idea, he should take responsibility. David pressed even harder. We needed an answer soon. The rent was due in 2 weeks. Mark said he'd think about it and hung up. David had been holding back laughter, while I was practically on the verge of a heart attack from how funny it was. I know that in words, it may not convey it, but in person, listening to his responses and his tone of voice, it was simply priceless. I asked David if he really thought his father would fall for it. He replied that his father's greatest fear was spending his retirement on anyone other than himself. Over the next 10 days, David called Mark 4 more times. "You have to remember that our fictional rent was due in 2 weeks, so the clock was ticking." Each time, Mark would mention bills or offer advice on which services to cut. He suggested perhaps we move, but David explained that if we did, we would live too far away and wouldn't be able to visit them as often. Maybe only every 2 months, because David would have to commute even further to work. Mark would murmur, agree with him, and then resume thinking. By the end of the 2nd week, when our landlord had, quote-unquote, given us an ultimatum, Susan told us separately that Mark was barely sleeping. Then, Mark appeared at our house. I was in the kitchen and stayed there while they talked in the living room. Mark said he had come to apologize. He admitted he had gone too far at dinner. He conceded that modern women like me could work if they wanted to. He acknowledged that he had meddled where he shouldn't have and hoped there were no hard feelings. David asked if that meant he would help us with money. Mark suggested it would be better if I looked for something new, perhaps a less demanding part-time job. The problem was I had already resigned, and we needed the money now. Mark replied that he couldn't just give us $2,000 a month from his retirement fund. As we thought he might die in our living room because he was sweating like a false witness, it was time to end the prank. I walked into the living room and told Mark I had good news. I hadn't left my job to be a stay-at-home wife, but to start my own business. We were financially stable, didn't need his money, and it had all been a hilarious prank, just not for Mark. He stared at me and then turned to look at David, who wasn't laughing with me. He also wasn't laughing at his son. David explained that he needed to understand what it meant to preach traditional gender roles. Mark was quick to criticize me for working, but as soon as he thought he'd have to shell out money, he became a bundle of excuses. Mark turned red and started shouting. We feared for a second time that he would have a heart attack. He called me manipulative and labeled me the type of woman who destroys families. He used a word I won't repeat. It rhymes with witch and starts with B, too. David pointed to the door. Mark insisted he wouldn't leave until David came to his senses and filed for divorce. David opened the door and motioned for him to leave. He warned him that if he didn't leave now, he'd be leaving in a less cordial manner. Mark mumbled something about women before storming out. David made sure the door was securely locked once he was outside. I called Susan that evening to make sure there wouldn't be any problems between us. Mark had told her what happened, but he demanded an apology from me. I asked if she knew what he had called me, but she justified it by saying he was upset and people say things they don't mean when they're like that. She said I had humiliated him and should have let him voice his opinion at dinner without causing such a fuss. I replied that we hadn't done anything wrong, it was just a simple prank. Unlike him, who is always very good at giving opinions about others, Mark disrespected me, but for a prank, he was acting like the biggest princess in the city. Susan didn't like me calling him that and claimed we had tricked him. I replied that it only revealed who he truly is. She ended the call. An hour later, David said he had texted his mom and warned her that if she was going to side with his father, then he would cut ties with both of them. He wouldn't tolerate his father treating me that way, and his mother excusing it. My parents called the next day because David had told them. My parents believe Mark got what he deserved. 3 months have passed. We haven't spoken to my in-laws since then, and I've already started my business. I'd love to say I miss my in-laws, but to do that, I'd need to have good in-laws, and that's not the case. I could forgive Susan, but she was defending her husband, and that put her in the enemy camp. Susan has texted David several times, asking to talk. He hasn't responded, but I can see it's affecting him, and since he's been such a great husband, I decided to do something for him. I called Susan and suggested we get coffee. She hesitated, but accepted. We met at a place when I knew Mark would be busy. I didn't apologize because I didn't feel it, but I told her that David missed her. I said he was as stubborn as his father and wouldn't contact her first, but it was clear he was struggling. Susan admitted that she missed him too, adding that Mark wouldn't allow it until we apologized. I made it clear that Mark wouldn't receive an apology and that she needed to stand up to Mark because we were talking about her relationship with her son. I was having a launch event for my business in 2 weeks. I wanted her to come without Mark. She replied that she wasn't sure if she could. I assured her that she could and that she should because her son needed her. After that, I left. I didn't tell David about that meeting. On the day of the event, I was talking to a potential client when I saw Susan walk in. She came alone, and David was on the other side of the room. He saw her. He didn't move at first, but then he walked toward her and they embraced. Susan was crying. David's eyes welled up, but he made no sound. They talked in a corner for about 20 minutes while I attended to the guests. When I finally got to them, Susan hugged me too. The good thing is that she not only did the right thing for her son, but she also apologized to me. She told me she had informed Mark she was coming, and he replied that if she walked out the door, she shouldn't come back. She left anyway. That's how she switched sides. The rest of the event went well. By the end of the night, I confirmed 2 clients and several others requested meetings. David and Susan went out to dinner. He came back around 11 and said they talked for hours. She told him that Mark had barely spoken to her in the 3 months since the fight. He spent his time in his garage workshop. Susan started coming over to our house every couple of weeks. She never mentioned Mark, and David didn't either. As far as I know, he still ignores the fact that she sees us. Last month, I found out I'm pregnant. We weren't trying for a baby, but we weren't preventing it either. I'm about 8 weeks along. Everyone is happy, although I don't know Mark's opinion. I haven't told Mark, and I don't plan to. David says his mom asks him if she should tell him. He says no, that when Mark is ready to apologize for what he said to me and how he treated his own son, then they can talk. Until then, he won't be involved. The irony is that Mark's dream was probably something like this: his daughter-in-law at home raising his grandchildren. Except I plan to run a business, and he won't see any of it because he couldn't keep his opinions to himself. We're figuring out how to organize ourselves for when the baby arrives. David's firm allows him to go fully remote, which helps. My parents have already offered to babysit once or twice a week. That's how things are. I don't know if Mark will come to his senses before the baby is born. I don't know if he ever will. David says he's tired of waiting for his father to act like a normal person. I'm focusing on preparing for the baby and maintaining the business. Update 1. This is an update to my previous post about quitting my job and the situation with my father-in-law, Mark. There are some new things happening in my life right now. About 2 weeks after my initial post, David received a call from his uncle Dan. Dan is Mark's younger brother and lives 3 hours away. David hadn't seen him in about 2 years. They were never close, but Dan would occasionally show up at family gatherings. Dan mentioned that through Susan he found out David and Mark weren't speaking. He wanted to meet with David to talk. David was wary, but Dan assured him he wasn't taking sides. David agreed to lunch. They met at a place halfway between our home and where Dan was visiting some friends. David called me afterward and said it went well. Dan asked about the argument, and David gave him the short version. Dan said Mark was always stubborn and that it didn't surprise him. What David didn't know was that Dan went straight to Mark after that lunch and told him everything, including my pregnancy. Susan called me the next day. Mark had found out about the baby and was furious that she had hidden it from him. He accused her of betraying him and choosing David over their marriage. Susan tried to explain, but Mark left the house and she didn't know where he went. We don't know where he was, but later he arrived at our house. We were having dinner, and when David opened the door, Mark pushed his way in. He blurted out that he couldn't believe we had hidden the pregnancy from him, that no matter what happened between us, he had a right to know he was going to be a grandfather. David replied that those rights were only for people capable of apologizing for the things they said. Mark assured him he came to talk, not to fight. I stayed in the kitchen. I heard everything, but I didn't want to be in the same room. Mark commented that he had been thinking. He admitted he might have gone too far at the birthday dinner. He argued that he came from a different generation, and things were different back then. He asked why David couldn't accept that his father had different values. David replied that he could accept different values. What he wouldn't tolerate was disrespect. Mark claimed he had never disrespected anyone. I had to remind him of the things he said months ago when we stopped talking to him, which Mark justified by saying we humiliated him with our prank. I walked into the living room to ask him why we had humiliated him. He responded that we made him believe we were struggling financially and played with his conscience. I pointed out that his conscience wouldn't have bothered him if he truly believed what he preached. If he truly thought wives should stay at home, he would have been delighted to support us. Instead, he panicked when he had to put his money where his mouth was. He replied that wasn't the point. The point was that we lied. I retorted that he had been lying for years. Every comment about working women or insinuating I was a bad wife for having a career was a lie about respecting me. He accused me of twisting his words. David asked him to leave. He insisted he wouldn't go until it was resolved. He wanted to be in his grandson's life. David explained that being a part of that started with an apology to me. A real one, not an excuse about generational differences. Mark looked at me and blurted out, "Fine. I'm sorry if anything I said offended you." I replied that wasn't an apology. He asked what else I wanted. I asked him to admit he was wrong, to say that what he told me was cruel and unjustified. He clenched his jaw, declared that he wasn't going to stand there and renounce everything he believed just to make me feel better. I replied that there was nothing more to discuss then. He turned to David and said he couldn't believe a son would choose his wife over his father. David retorted that he chose his wife over a bully and told him to leave now. Mark left. An hour later, Susan called. She said Mark came home ranting about how disrespectful we were. Susan suggested he make a proper apology, and he ordered her not to interfere. Then she added something else. Mark was always proud and controlling, but it worsened after he retired. Without a job, he focused his obsession on the family. She admitted she had been excusing him for years, but she was tired. 2 days later, she called again. This time crying, she said Mark had asked her for a separation, saying that if she continued to see David secretly and side with us, their marriage was over. She responded that it was absurd, but he had already called a lawyer. Mark had moved into the guest room and wasn't speaking to her. The following weeks were tense as Susan called with updates. Last week, Susan came for dinner. She wasn't doing very well with all this. Mark signed a lease for a one-bedroom apartment across town. He was moving at the end of the month. She said she begged him to reconsider, but he said their marriage had been dying for years and that David's actions only made it clear they wanted different things. I don't feel guilty about this, nor does David. Mark is a controlling person who expects these reactions to make us do what he wants. Trying to fix this will only make him much worse. Update 2. Another update with some quite revealing things about Mark. Mark moved out 6 weeks ago. Susan spends more time with us so she doesn't feel alone in the house. It's quite good because she has company and helps me with preparations for when the baby arrives. She seems better without Mark, but also with a sadness that is hard to describe. She can laugh and then suddenly stare out the window. I think she's better without him, but it's not my marriage, and I understand that she misses him. A few weeks ago, David received a message from his Uncle Dan. After basically telling his brother about my pregnancy, which created this earthquake, David wasn't eager to talk to him. Dan wanted to talk to David, but he ignored him. Dan insisted for several days that it was important. David finally responded and asked what he wanted. Dan explained that he needed to show him something in person. David said he wasn't interested. Dan continued, saying it was about Mark and Susan and that he had to see it. Dan had some papers, and they were Mark's bank statements. David didn't understand at first. Dan explained that he helped Mark open the new account when he moved, as Dan works at a bank. He can see his father's account movements. He pointed out some account movements that repeated every month for exactly $500. They all went to the same account. Dan said he asked his brother, but Mark brushed him off, saying, "It's none of your business." But Dan was curious and looked in the system to see who the account number belonged to. It was a woman I'll call Jennifer. All names are changed, if you're wondering. Dan knew that name. Jennifer worked with Mark at the plant 20 years ago. Dan investigated and found that Jennifer lived an hour away from where my in-laws lived. He drove there one afternoon and saw Mark's car in the driveway. I have to write it or you already know what's happening. Dan said he confronted Mark the week before, and Mark finally admitted that he had been seeing Jennifer for 3 years. According to him, it was nothing physical, just friends, and he was sending her money to help her with expenses because she was disabled and couldn't work. It's likely all a lie, but Dan believes Susan needs to know, and David should be the one to tell her. He thought about it for a few days and finally decided to tell his mother what was happening. He thought that with the divorce, there would be no point in making her feel even worse. But since she already felt bad and guilty about what was happening, he finally made the decision for her to know everything. Susan already had some suspicions but had never really investigated. At her age, she didn't think he could be having an affair. She asked him not to tell Mark yet, as David wanted to go yell at his father. Susan wanted to do it herself, so he promised to keep his anger in check. That was 3 weeks ago. Susan called Mark and asked him to meet her at the house. He didn't deny it but gave a similar version to Dan's. Susan replied that it didn't matter, that what mattered was that he had been lying for years while lecturing everyone about morals and traditions. He claimed Jennifer was just a friend who needed help. She asked if she should believe him. He replied that she could do whatever she wanted. Susan kicked him out and told him they would communicate through their lawyers. She no longer sees any path other than divorce. Until now, she hadn't wanted a divorce, but this information changes everything. Mark called David 2 days later. He didn't answer, so Mark left a voicemail. The transcription of the message was that David shouldn't have gotten involved in this and that he's a weakling like Dan. That he knows he'll need a father when I fail him, as all women do, but he can forget he has one because, for Mark, he no longer has a son. On less unpleasant matters than Mark, we had the anatomy scan, and everything is fine. We're having a boy. Susan cried when she found out, remembering that Mark always wanted a grandson. The nursery is almost ready. David painted it gray, and Susan bought a bookshelf that he assembled over the weekend. My business is doing so well that I stopped accepting new clients until after the baby is born. With what I have now, I'm busy enough. I'm setting up systems for someone else to take over when I go on maternity leave. That's the problem with being your own boss. There's no one else to cover your work when you take a vacation. Update 3. The baby arrived early. Everything happened quickly. David rushed me to the hospital, and I was admitted immediately. Labor lasted 8 hours. Mark knows our son was born. Dan told him. This time, we didn't care that he told him. It wasn't a big secret. Mark never contacted us, and he didn't ask Dan any questions about whether the baby was healthy or not. The divorce was finalized very recently. Susan kept the house in the divorce negotiations. The only problem is that she doesn't have enough savings to survive. She has the house, but not enough to support herself for the rest of her life. We are helping, but she wants to find some work to cover her basic expenses. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but at her age and with her education, it's likely that any job she finds won't be enough to maintain that house and her other expenses. I don't want to get into someone else's personal finances, but that's the reality. Since our son was born, Susan comes almost daily. She helps feed him and with laundry, and she holds him while I sleep. David took 3 weeks off and is now back at work, but he is a present father when he's not working. We're finding the rhythm exhausting, but we knew what we were signing up for when we became parents. My business is almost managing itself. There's someone covering my tasks, and I contribute a little where I can. I only work, if you can even call it work, about an hour a day. We have a call, and I check some emails, but that's all. The idea is to gradually get back into it. I know the business is suffering a bit now as there's no one bringing in new clients, but for now, it will have to wait until I can be 100%. Somehow, we'll make it work. Susan says Mark is openly dating Jennifer now. Dan told her that he took Jennifer to a family gathering last month and introduced her as his girlfriend. Susan doesn't care. She says Mark can do whatever he wants with whoever he wants. She's just grateful she no longer has to deal with his moods. Update 4. When I made this post 2.5 years ago, I was a first-time mom trying to figure out how to keep a business running while raising a newborn. Also, how to confront a father-in-law whom, along with David, I taught a lesson through a prank. You can read my previous posts on my profiles if you don't know what I'm talking about. That way, you'll understand everything that has happened during this time. This will be a final update. Susan had to sell her house, as it was too expensive to maintain. Neither with our help nor with her job's income could she manage, but she got a good amount from the sale and was able to buy something smaller. Now she only has a part-time job that she keeps for distraction, so she's not home all day with nothing to do. We've offered to help her because, combined with what she got from the sale, it would have been enough for her to live comfortably, but she likes to work and feel useful. After selling her house, she lived with us for about 3 months until she found a new place to buy. It was fine. She helped with the baby and was a great guest, but she valued her independence and wanted to find her own place. After living with Mark, she wanted a life very different from before. A few months after giving birth, when everything started to feel more organized, we hired a nanny and I was able to return to my work. That has also been good, but there's not much to tell. I've kept it small because I didn't want to get a job like my previous one, where I worked many hours a week, including Saturdays and Sundays. I'm not saying I work few hours, but I have a balance between being a mom and having a job. We've heard little from Mark. Dan, his brother, cut ties with him after Mark borrowed $7,000 and never paid it back. We still don't know what he spent it on. Probably on his girlfriend because sometime later, perhaps 5 months, they broke up. I think he broke up with her. Or it might have been the other way around. He tried to reach out to David, and they had a conversation one day when Mark visited David's workplace. It must have been very bad because David decided not to give me all the details. He probably spoke ill of me and Susan again because David said he never wanted to hear from him again. How do I know? Because that's what he used to do. Such an attitude doesn't surprise me either. It's almost impossible for this man to change. Now our life is so peaceful and boring that it doesn't seem worth writing about. But an update after so long seems appropriate. Edit. Since I've been asked for more details about Mark, I asked David what they talked about that day. He didn't want to tell me because I was too stressed with our son due to some health issues that are better now, combined with the rest of life, and he didn't want to put me in a bad mood. Yes. He said a few bad things about me and also about Susan that aren't worth repeating. You can imagine them, and they'll surely be very close to the things he said. But the important thing is that the money he asked his brother for was to buy an engagement ring for his girlfriend. I don't want to reread all my posts, but maybe I didn't mention that she is about 15 years younger than Mark. Not younger than David and me, but younger than him. They were going to get married until he caught her stealing money. Not much, maybe $200 here and $300 there. But Mark thought she had been unfaithful with someone her own age. Mark wanted David to give him money for the initial payment to a lawyer who asked for at least $2,500 to take his case. David refused, and that's when Mark said all those things about me and his mother. Another thing he mentioned is that his girlfriend was sending money to her family, but she was doing it behind Mark's back. That was the money she was stealing. Her family wasn't what Mark would approve of. There were alcohol addictions, and he wouldn't have given the money voluntarily. David hasn't heard anything from Mark since that day, but he heard that Mark asked other relatives for money. After what happened with his brother, I don't think anyone has lent him anything.